The courtyard was hushed, a sacred silence wrapped around the moment. Then, slicing through it like a blade, "Salute your commander-in-chief." Heads snapped toward the voice. A man in a long overcoat, unmistakable, swaggered forward with bodyguards in tow. The royal guard remained motionless, unshaken. The man's tone sharpened. "Did you not hear me?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras blinked to life. A little boy whispered, "Is he in trouble now?" What followed wasn't a clash, it was a masterclass. Because the power wasn't in the man barking orders. It was in the one who refused to flinch. It was a grey, brisk morning outside Buckingham Palace. A chill danced across the pavement, but the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The changing of the guard, a ritual older than memory, was moments away. School children waved tiny Union Jacks, giggling and wide-eyed. Retired soldiers, medals glinting in the pale sun, stood proudly. Tourists clutched cameras, eager to capture even a flicker of tradition. And then, disruption. A convoy of black SUVs rolled in, their presence jarring against the pageantry. Doors swung open. Men in suits. Earpieces. And at the center, unmistakable, Donald Trump. He wasn't here on state business. No diplomatic mission. Just another stop on his unofficial world tour, a spectacle in search of a spotlight. Since leaving office, Trump's appearances had grown louder, his gestures more theatrical. Where once he commanded with title, now he demanded with presence. The British crowd murmured. Some recognized him. Others stared, confused. But one thing was clear, this was not a part of the ceremony. Trump strode toward the gates, flanked by aides and cameras. His coat flapped in the wind, hair defiant as ever. He paused, scanning the guards until his eyes locked onto one, a young man, upright, unmoving, carved from centuries of discipline. Trump leaned to an aide and smirked. "This'll go viral," he said under his breath. Then he stepped forward, past the barricades. "Watch this," he declared. The crowd tensed. The air thickened. The royal guard did not move. And in that silence, uniform pressed, jaw tight, eyes forward, stood a quiet challenge. Because this wasn't just a man guarding a gate. It was a symbol refusing to bend. And Trump, used to applause and obedience, had just stepped into a tradition that didn't flinch. Trump squared off just feet from the guard. For a moment, the world narrowed. No crowd, no palace, just one man staring down another. He raised his hand in a mock salute, sharp, exaggerated, then let it drop with an audible scoff. "You boys are trained to salute authority," he barked, voice booming through the cold air. "Well, I'm the man who made America great again." The royal guard didn't blink. Didn't twitch. A gust of wind tugged at the edge of Trump's coat. The plume on the guard's bearskin cap fluttered slightly, like a banner refusing to yield. His polished buttons caught a glint of morning light. Still, nothing. The silence was no longer ceremonial, it was heavy. Uneasy. Tourists lowered their phones. Children stopped fidgeting. Somewhere in the crowd, an old man muttered, "That's not how it's done here." Trump stepped closer. His voice dropped, but his tone sharpened. "You're a soldier. I'm a commander. Show some respect." He jabbed a finger toward the guard's chest. "Salute me." The guard didn't move. Trump exhaled through his nose, half frustrated, half amused. He was putting on a show, but the stage wasn't cooperating. Then came the line. Low, muttered, but loud enough to carry. "This is why you lost the empire. No guts." Gasps. Audible and immediate. A little girl clutched her flag tighter. Two elderly veterans exchanged a look, not of anger, but of stunned offense. Even the guards posted further down the forecourt seemed to stand a hair straighter, as if bracing for a storm. The young guard remained still. Expression unreadable. Yet something in the set of his jaw, the steel in his silence, seemed to say everything. Trump turned, half laughing, scanning the crowd for validation. His entourage offered tight smiles, the kind that begged not to be noticed. The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't cheer. They just watched. The tension was no longer about politics. It wasn't about nations. It was about dignity. Trump had come looking for submission. What he found was something he didn't recognize, quiet, immovable resolve. And in that moment, the spectacle began to shift. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it just refuses to bow. A quiet voice spoke, calm, steady, and deeply British. But it wasn't the guard. From the palace entrance, an older man emerged. His medals were fewer but well-worn, his uniform precise, his presence commanding in a way that needed no performance. He was a former officer, now the royal guard overseer. The kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. "Sir," he began, with a tone that was both courteous and unyielding, "this is sacred ground. Not a stage." Trump opened his mouth, halfway into a retort, but the man didn't pause. "Our guards serve the crown. Not personality. Not politics. And certainly not ego." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle, like breath held in unison. "They don't salute power," the overseer continued. "They embody it." The weight of the words hung in the air. Heavy. Immovable. "You demanded a salute," he said, eyes fixed on Trump. "But you were offered something far rarer, restraint." The courtyard stood still. Even the wind seemed to hush. Trump, for once, said nothing. His entourage fidgeted, suddenly aware of the optics. The crowd, tourists, veterans, children, said nothing either. But the silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Then, quietly, calmly, the young guard moved. He didn't turn his head. Didn't break posture. But he lifted his right hand, slow and deliberate, and adjusted the strap of his rifle across his shoulder. It was nothing. And it was everything. A small, precise motion, not for Trump, but for duty. For discipline. And in that movement, a line had been drawn. He remained statuesque. Silent. Unmoved. But the atmosphere had changed. A boy near the front whispered, "He's like a mountain." An elderly woman dabbed her eyes, her lips trembling with pride. Even those who had come merely for spectacle now stood in quiet awe. Because in that moment, it became clear. True authority doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't chase applause. It simply is. And standing in front of a man who spent his life demanding attention, the guard gave him none. That silence? It roared louder than anything Trump could have said. Within hours, footage of the encounter surged across the internet like a tidal wave. Captured on dozens of phones from every angle, the moment played on loop, the silence, the smirk, the rifle strap adjustment. By sunset, hashtags were trending worldwide. #Palace standoff, #silent strength, and #the guard who didn't blink. On Twitter, a royal guard just schooled Trump without saying a word. Absolute legend. Dignity is the new power move. That man's silence hit harder than any speech. Reddit threads exploded with praise. Veterans, historians, and teenagers all weighed in, dissecting the posture, the poise, the restraint. One popular comment read, "It wasn't a lack of response. It was the response." Teachers began showing the clip in classrooms. Not for politics, but for principle. A civics instructor in London rewrote a lesson plan overnight. On the whiteboard the next morning. "Strength is sometimes silence." CNN ran the headline, "Standoff at the Palace, when decorum defeated ego." The BBC called it a masterclass in modern composure. Even Piers Morgan, never short on opinions, declared, "That was the finest display of British poise in modern memory." Across the Atlantic, American veterans chimed in with surprising unanimity. "I didn't fight for loud men with microphones," one former Marine tweeted. "I fought for men like him, composed, steady, principled." The palace, famously tight-lipped, confirmed only that the guard remained in full accordance with protocol. But what they didn't confirm, and didn't need to, was the emotional impact. Within days, thousands of handwritten letters and digital notes poured in. Many came from children. One stood out. Written in blue crayon on lined paper, it read, "Dear Royal Guard, you are my hero. I want to stand strong like you someday." The moment became more than viral. It became a mirror, reflecting what people admired but often forgot: composure, restraint, integrity. In a world obsessed with soundbites and spectacle, a soldier in silence had captured the world's attention. No words. No anger. No retreat. Just presence. And in that, a message louder than any insult hurled, any order barked. True strength doesn't posture. It stands. And when it stands unwavering, even the world has to sit up and listen. The confrontation outside Buckingham Palace didn't trigger sirens or arrests. But its echoes reached corridors of power on both sides of the Atlantic. Though no official protocol had been violated, the British government quietly expressed grave disappointment through diplomatic channels. Behind closed doors, ministers called the display disrespectful and unbecoming of a former head of state. The palace, in its characteristically understated way, issued a rare public comment. We honor those who stand guard over our traditions. Their silence speaks volumes. It wasn't directed at anyone by name. But everyone knew exactly who it was for. Trump, meanwhile, faced a different kind of reckoning. Former allies distanced themselves, choosing silence over defense. Late-night comedians had a field day, replaying the footage with biting commentary. Trump tried to command respect, one joked, and got schooled by a statue. But the backlash wasn't just in soundbites. A luxury hotel in Vienna cancelled his upcoming booking, citing a misalignment with our institution's values. Several European sponsors quietly withdrew from a planned speaking tour. For a man who once prided himself on commanding headlines, Trump was suddenly the story, and not in the way he liked. He didn't lash out. Not immediately. But weeks later, during a televised interview, a journalist brought up the palace incident. Trump's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered. And then, almost imperceptibly, his tone softened. Maybe he was right not to salute, he muttered. He's got discipline. I'll give him that. It wasn't an apology. But it was a crack in the armor. For a man whose brand was dominance, something had shifted. He hadn't been challenged by argument or protest, but by stillness. And the world had watched him lose, not in battle, but in presence. Commentators noted it. Psychologists unpacked it. Cultural critics wrote op-eds with titles like, "The Day Ego Met Duty, and Lost." But for many, the real consequence wasn't political or professional. It was personal. A man so used to commanding rooms had, for once, been rendered small, not by force, but by integrity. And the guard? He never spoke. Never gave an interview. He simply resumed his post the next day. Same stance. Same silence. Because for those who stand for something greater than themselves, there is no need to gloat. The moment had already spoken. And its echo still rings. Weeks passed. The royal guard returned to his post as he always had, upright, disciplined, and silent. To him, it was just another day of duty. To the world, it was something else entirely. Tourists began arriving not just to see the changing of the guard, but to see him, the man who hadn't flinched. Children waved from behind velvet ropes. Veterans, some with canes and ribbons on their jackets, paused to offer silent nods of respect. He never responded. That was the point. No medals were pinned to his chest. No press conference was called. No book deals. No documentaries. Just the continued rhythm of his boots on ancient stone, and the quiet pride of knowing he had done his job without compromise. But beyond the palace gates, the story lived on. In classrooms, in dining rooms, in places where character is taught more than discussed. Because this wasn't a story about confrontation. It was a story about conviction. About how silence, in the right hands, becomes strength. In a world where noise often drowns out meaning, one man stood still and said everything. He reminded us that restraint isn't weakness. It's courage. That respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. And that power, the real kind, doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a spine. So now the question turns to us. What would you have done in his place? When your values are tested, when your pride is provoked? Will you raise your voice, or your standards? Because sometimes the boldest thing you can do is simply stand your ground.